We're discussing the church and its identity. Everything is theological, especially in the church. If word is being replaced by image in contemporary culture, then people, whether consciously or unconsciously, are deriving more theology than you could put in a book the moment they walk into a church or don't walk in. Theology, and more important, theological interpretation, come more often from our experience than from words on a page or in a pulpit. And really the implication is that the architecture of a church, the worship actions, pew placement, and human visibility are having more effect than anything anyone is saying in one's pulpit. What the local church looks like, what it acts upon, how old the building is, how old its members are, what it stresses, what it doesn't stress. That's the gospel to the American community because that's what it directly experiences. This is sometimes called a hermeneutic. Cultural hermeneutics plays a huge role in the interpretation of events and perceptions of reality, so that the lens through which the American community interprets the gospel is the local church, and unfortunately, not the Bible. If the local church is the hermeneutic of the gospel to its community, you can imagine how differently the gospel can be interpreted. The result of this knowledge is that the church's mission must translate into the church's persona and in its perception of its community. And in the perception of the community. Maintaining the church as a major community participant is becoming more of a necessity for the church as a contact point to its community. The embodied church members will also need to buy into the church's persona, especially because it will reinforce the continuation of the church's interpretation to its community. I became really consciously aware of how small, even small details were, and how they were so theologically charged when I was living in LA. I was serving on a staff with a multi-ethnic church in one of the northern suburbs, and during one of our Sunday morning services, we would dismiss our children to go to the children's church from the sanctuary. One of our pastors would get up from the pulpit to pray a prayer of dismissal for the children, then all the kids in the church would get up to leave to go to the children's church, and they would sort of all run toward the exit on the far left side of the sanctuary, wait for the pastor to finish the prayer, and then run out the exit toward the children's church. Pastors would often remark that the children were the future of the church, and some sitting in the service, seeing how the children were to the far left side and how the pastor was behind the pulpit, subconsciously perceived a level of irony to what was happening. Without intention, children looked as though they were being cast aside every service, and the pastoral pair was sort of adding insult to the injury. Thus, our church is actually deterring families with that practice rather than trying to attract them. One day, the pastoral staff began discussing how we could change how we dismissing the children. We invited the children to the stage before our prayer and then had our staff come off the stage to pray with them. By physically centering our children in the sanctuary, we were theologically reinforcing to our congregation that we valued the children and our families. Please understand that this is a small detail, had little correlation with how we actually treated our children in that church. Our church had a long way to go to improving its children's ministries. Nonetheless, it illustrated how even moving a group of kids during a service provides a theologically powerful statement about what that church values. Everything is theological. And here's the problem with my incident. It's not isolated. This stuff happens all over the place and all over the country time and again. As an unintended consequence of what these theological images are, cumulatively, they add up and they have a value statement that it says to our students and to our kids that they have to overcome when they darken the doors of our churches. Moreover, youth don't always have the sociological sophistication to explain to our churches that these are theological narratives and that they're happening to them every Sunday, and they create powerful image. Images and narratives such as these are valued much higher to our students than a pre-scripted time such as a sermon that can be rehearsed and practiced. Thus, the picture being illustrated to many of our students is that the church is either just an unjust organization or it's an organization that just simply doesn't get them. We've got to overcome that part of our identity. And that's one of the challenges of our ecclesiology in our church that we've got to come to grips with. I encourage you to think through every aspect of how you deliver theological images and think of how it would be perceived to a congregant or somebody who would visit your church for the first time. It's so critical. More important than what you say is how it's perceived. That is obviously why we have different interpretations. I encourage you to study and to pray and think about how you'll actualize what your service looks like and how you are treating people. Thanks again for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you in our next segment. This is Dave Pafford.